Lola Russell is an Australian actress who should be more well known, in fact. She was acting in university drama theatres in the 1940s at Melbourne University, went overseas for 9 years to get some experience and came back. And she was actually an Australian pioneer. She was acting in the very early days of television in the 1960s in shows like Consider Your Verdict and Beauty and the Beast. And she was also a pioneer actress. She was the first person to produce Samuel Beckett plays in Australia. And she didn't get the easy play that everybody thinks of, Waiting for Godot. She got the very hard one, Endgame. She was also an actress who was concerned about the future of drama and children. And so she would be producing plays for school children in things like the university theatre companies in Alexander Theatre at Monash and at La Trobe in the Agora, and in also entertainment in the parks. So I remember that from the 1970s. And so she was out there really trying to produce drama a lot, but on the fringes, so we don't sort of know her as a well-known name. But she did actually appear in a Paul Cox movie, and she and her husband were also in the first Australian movie to win a prize at the Cannes Film Festival in the early 1960s.
So she is definitely an Australian icon.
Absolutely.
How does the Maltese Connection come in?
Well, Lola asked me to edit and publish her book, and so I was roaming through her incredibly wonderful memories, and I noticed that her grandfather, who she lived with her parents, his name was Atsopardi, and I thought, that's an unusual name. And she mentioned that her grandfather's father, Antonio Atsopardi, arrived in Melbourne in 1838. Now, I studied Australian history and I thought Melbourne white settlement was 1835. That's only 3 years after Melbourne was settled by white people. That's very early. So I did a bit of research. And her great-grandfather, Antonio Atsopardi, was the first free Maltese settler to settle in Melbourne and possibly in Australia. He was on a merchant ship and he'd come from Malta, but he was sailing between Sydney and Melbourne doing trade and things. So he first arrived in 1838, but he hadn't settled here, he was still on the ships. But the story is that in the very early 1840s, he went up Elizabeth Street, and of course at that time it would have been a sewer.
Yeah.
But there was a little cafe there near what is the old post office building. And he went in and he sat down and he was served a cup of tea by a very nice young Scottish girl, and they fell in love. So they got married, and they also settled around near the post office. Now, behind the post office is a little lane called Angelo Lane, and that is named after their eldest son, Angelo Atsopardi. Now, they did very well in the gold rush because he was doing general store business and supplying food and blankets and shovels, and they earned quite a lot of money. Around the 1880s, when we have Marvellous Melbourne, and Marvellous Melbourne was because of the gold rush, it's become a very wealthy city. It was in fact the second largest city in the British Empire. And there were opera companies coming, and because Antonio could speak Maltese and Italian, they could talk to the opera singers. Their sons were lithographers, they produced the programs, they were doing very, very well. The second son, Valletta, was apparently a very charming young boy. And
so Valletta was the name?
Valletta was the name, yes. Yeah. He named his children after places and people.
Right.
Curious mix of Scottish and Maltese. It's very strange. So his name is Valletta Sandeman, which was his mother's surname. So Valletta was the second son, and Valletta made the mistake of falling in love with another Scottish girl, but she was from the wrong end of Richmond, and she was merely a tailoress. And so they got married, and the parents weren't happy, and the marriage was a complete disaster. But apparently they managed to produce 8 children. He'd been working as a lithographer, but he liked working like his father did in a sort of general all-purpose store. And he'd had one in Preston and got very, very sick. Valletta ended up in hospital, I think it was the Alfred Hospital, with typhoid for 6 months. And when he recovered, he was quite old by this time, and his eldest daughter was in her 40s, and he was being looked after by the eldest daughter, and he said he'd like to own a little shop. And he found this one on the corner of King and La Trobe Street, which is, in fact, the oldest house in the CBD.
Still standing there.
Still standing there. It was built by a family called Heffernan, and they'd been living in the house for 20 years, and there was a lady at the time who had an all-purpose store at the time in the shop, and she liked Valletta and he liked her, so she sold the business and later the house to him. And so there had been only 2 families who have owned this house since 1850, the Heffernans and the Atsopardis, and now Lola. So Valletta took over this shop and he lived in it with his eldest daughter, and then his middle daughter, who is Lola's mother, Beatrice, they noticed that Beatrice wasn't doing very well at school. Now, I don't know whether she had dyslexia or a learning difficulty, but she got to the age of 12 and 13 and still could not read or write. But she was very good with, she could remember numbers and figures. So she had developed a big profession as a milliner. And she had got married to a young man, but she was also living in the house. And Lola told me at one stage there was her grandfather and 5 women in the house.
Oh my goodness.
Because of all the aunts and various people that bunked in. So Valletta had this shop until he died in the 1940s. And then when Lola's mother died and father died, obviously, then Lola inherited it too.
And she's still living there to this very day?
She's still living there to this very day. Lola was born in the house in 1921.
And has also run the cafe, and it still is?
And has run the cafe. This house has been producing and supplying food to that corner of Melbourne since 1899. So yes, you can go to Russell's tea rooms and you will be served a cup of tea. The crockery might not match, but that's right, it will be clean, it will be a good cup of tea.
It's all part of the experience though, yeah?
Coffee, they have cakes.
So Lola and her husband still are
George really does the operating. Lola's 96 and a little bit frail, but no, George will make the cup of tea. You'll get it eventually. And he'll make the sandwiches.
So going back to Angelo Azzapati, there is a connection between Angelo Azzapati and the Carlton Football Club.
There is. I gave a talk about Lola's story at the Maltese Historical Society, and I loved that talk. It actually gave me more information than I gave them. And they told me, did I know anything about Angelo Azzapati? This is Lola's great uncle. And I said, no, I didn't. Well, apparently Angelo, who was the eldest, he played for the Carlton Football Club, and he was, I think, the first non-Anglo-Saxon player for an Australian football team. And so he played for a little while with Carlton, and he was known as the Maltese Knight.
Oh.
He actually didn't live very long. He only lived till he was about 50. And I found out that after he played for Carlton a little while, and he was also a government lithographer, for some reason he went to New Zealand and he started an optometry business. And I know this because Lola mentions he went to New Zealand, but a friend of mine from New Zealand who read the book leapt up and said, my goodness, here's the name of my optometrist in the book, because he still had his firm somewhere in New Zealand.
I'm going to go back to Antonio Azzapati, who was married to Margaret Senneman.
Yes.
And he had 5...
He had 5 children.
5 children.
We actually had 7, 2 of them died. The first one who died was a daughter, and she was one of the very first burials in the Melbourne Cemetery. Not the cemetery we know now, the very first one, which is now under Victoria Market. The book originally was published by a company called Palmer Higgs, but they went out of business. We got a new front cover designed, we found a book printer, and so now we have edition 2.
And that's City Kid.
City Kid. It's even better than the first one because it's got more pictures in it.
So now it can be found on?
And it can be found at my website, which is www.creativetext.com.au.